About 10 so far have joined on that. You can sit there.
You can hear she's on radio.
Hello everybody, thank you for joining us this evening as we celebrate the launch of Manjula Datta O'Connor's new book, Daughters of Durga, Dowries, Gender Violence and Family in Australia. She's in conversation tonight, but this is about. Before we commence, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Jagera and Turrbal people, and the traditional owners of the lands from which people are zooming in on tonight. I also pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that we are on unceded land. So a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. If everyone can please turn their phones to silent. You're of course welcome to keep your phones on and you're welcome to take photos and tweet about the event. We're at Avid Reader 4101. Anyone requiring the toilet is welcome to walk just out through that gate there, a few meters down towards the light. Some of you already noticed we have the bar open. It will open again after tonight if anybody wants to have a little drink for just a little while before the signing ends. There will be a Q&A after the session. It's going to be led off by a special guest star, Catherine Render. She'll also, the authors will be available for a signing after Q&A. Those people who are attending via Zoom, you're also welcome to ask any questions. Just type them into the chat box there, and we will be able to. We might have another last-minute guest star there. We can give those questions to you. You're also welcome to place any orders that you may have for the book on Zoom, and if you do it during this event, we can ask the author to sign it for you. Now on to the person of the hour. Manjula Datta O'Connor is a clinical psychiatrist specialising in migrant women's mental health, complex trauma and family violence. She chairs the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists Family Violence Psychiatry Network, is a clinician, researcher, advocate, and works closely with community in prevention of family violence. As founding director of the NGO Australasian Centre for Human Rights and Health, she led the anti-dowry abuse campaign, instigating a change to the Victorian Family Violence Protection Act in 2019, deeming demands for dowry, gifts and cash an act of family violence. She's now working to create change federally. In conversation with Manjula tonight is Priscilla Lal, a Brisbane lawyer and mother. She's a first-generation child of Indian and Sri Lankan migrants who came to Australia in the shadow to the white Australian policy. She comes to the conversation this evening with the lived experience of family and domestic violence and the stories and insights she has from the women of her wider family. She's slowly finding her voice in the hope that we can finally see real and systemic change in the lives of all women. Please make them both very welcome.
Thank you. I just wanted to start actually by thanking Dr. O'Connor for this book. I've expressed this before, but this is a book that was really important for me to read and is going to be important for lots of other brown girls to read. So I wanted to thank you for that straight up because it started some really important conversations in my family. And I think that it's going to do that for a lot of other Indian women. What I wanted to start with was just recognising, we know now that almost every week one woman in Australia is killed by a partner or an ex-partner. And we were just talking before we started that we've just seen a headline today of a woman who is an Australian who was just killed in Pakistan after she was refused the right to return home with her children to Australia. So this is not something that is going away. This is something that is with us right now. And we finally have some sense, I think, of momentum from the wider community and from government to finally recognise this is an issue and put some real funding behind changing it. But how important is it that this book was written particularly for women of the subcontinent, and how important is it that they be brought along with that conversation, I guess?
Thank you, Priscilla, and thank you everyone for coming. It's lovely to see you, and I had a lovely trip from Melbourne, so enjoying Brisbane. Priscilla, it was important to write the book because, firstly, because I've been seeing patients for about last 10, 12 years, And I heard stories that I felt needed to be told for a number of reasons. One was that the silence had to be broken in the community. And the second was to educate the service providers into learning about the complexity of the South Asian culture, which is 5,000 to 7,000 years old culture. And it's the same culture in continuity. And same people, similar religion, and very complex family structure that is not easily understandable if you are working with these women and listening to their story for an hour or half an hour. It's important for service providers to learn about how complex the issues are the women that face. It's important for policymakers to understand what the women actually require. It's important for the governments to understand where the money needs to be put, and for the community to recognize that it's no shame in talking about this thing. Domestic violence is a global problem. Domestic violence has been with us ever since human life began 250,000 years ago, probably. The patriarchy is what dominates the world. And if we are going to prevent domestic violence, we need to learn the cultural tools that patriarchy uses.
And I think that that's something that's really important. And you take us back in the book on a journey to ancient India.
Yes.
Right. And you started ancient India, and that's really important. But what I think struck me, and those overlays of culture we're going to have to speak about, and we all need to understand that. But what struck me was that at the core of all of this was that global problem, I guess, and that the men that are being abusive, whether they are South Asian or Australian or where they come from, it goes back to that same sort of handbook of power and control. And I think that, I think Jess Hill talks about, it seems almost like abusive men get a handbook about how to behave and how to exercise power and control. Yes. And it seems that at the core of it, those men get that handbook too. And when you take us back on that journey, you sort of talk about the importance of the connection between colonisation and patriarchy. Yes. What did that sort of journey, when you undertook that sort of, what did that look like for you?
So I took it back 5,000 years when India was the richest, the wealthiest country in the world. It contributed to more than 30% of the world's GDP, and did so right up until 1700 AD. So we are talking 3000 BC now. And what the evidence shows us is that the scriptures that are written at that time, 5,000 years ago in Sanskrit, which is the earliest language, complex language, and those scriptures that actually describe the various sciences, trigonometry, medicine, dentistry, plastic surgery, the concept of zero, the Pythagoras theorem, they all came out of India. And at the time, women were respected as equals. Women philosophers, women debaters were welcome in king's courts to debate men. And there were special words for these women, special terms for these women that recognized that these women did not want to get married and they want to just remain wise people, just like men could. Because India has a history of ascetics and sages collecting that knowledge and wisdom and sharing it with their pupils. Women were allowed to do the same.
So when does it fall apart?
I think it fell apart in about 1700 years ago. when we had a man called Manu. He was a lawman, a wise man. He was probably amongst the first men in the world to write a book for how humans should live their life. And in that, he wrote verses about how women should live their life. So some women, some of the verses were things like, where in a house a woman is respected and adorned, gods will bless that house and there will be lots of happiness. But then there are about 6 verses that completely demolish the women. A woman should always be dependent on a father or a brother or a husband or a son. And no matter what the husband does, she must always worship him. And she should never say anything bad about him. He can do whatever he likes, but she cannot say anything bad about him. And it shrank the world of the woman into just a dependent, submissive creature in the house. But there was a but, that this was written for Brahmins, effectively, upper class Brahmins, and for their women. And it was a flexible system in the sense that the caste system which was there was not rigid, and people and women in the lower castes, so-called lower castes, were not, they were free, they were flexible. But when the British came, they did a number of things to the culture that made it very rigid and made it kind of much more patriarchal. And what they did was they divided up the land in parcels of land and gave titles to men. No women got any title to the land. And the dowry system that was there as antemortem inheritance for the woman, because the boys got the inheritance, it being a patrilineal culture, it increased the value of the grooms. And it also meant the dowry value went up, and it simultaneously, the culture became much more rigid, much more patriarchal, and the women became much more devalued. And now we have research that is coming out only last year that colonization, wherever there was colonization, the rates of domestic violence are high in all those countries. We can look at our own Aboriginal population, look at South America, look at any country of the world where the colonizers went, they destroyed the local culture, which then gave rise to a racism against the local people. And so when the men felt insecure outside, they came home, and that was one place where they could exercise power.
And I think following on from that, where you have women who have no power, you've got this interesting dynamic that develops in South Indian cultures of women being the wielders then of patriarchy. And I think that's a dynamic that we don't necessarily see in Anglo cultures so much, but that idea that starts, as you point out, from birth as this natural preference for boys, definitely not for girls, a natural preference by mothers to only have sons, and then the bargaining of power and the role that mother-in-laws ultimately play in abusive contexts.
Yes, so that's the most interesting thing, is that a woman who was oppressed and suppressed in her own father's home, she goes to her husband's home, and she is the lowest in the hierarchy, because Indian and all South Asian cultures are hierarchical. Older people have more power than younger people, and men have more power than women. So you have that system in which the daughter-in-law has the least power, especially a new daughter-in-law. And
I think you called her a mat on the floor when we were talking earlier. She's supposed to just be a mat for everybody.
For everyone. So her job is to look after and domestic servitude towards the rest of the family, look after the mother-in-law, the father-in-law, the husband, everyone else. and she needs to suppress her own desires and her own needs. Now, in that system, the mother-in-law makes sure that she stays at the bottom of the hierarchy. I want to make it very clear. Please don't think every single home in India or in South Asia is like that. Please not. I come from a extended family system where you will read in the book how my grandmother, my father's mother, she loved us. She absolutely adored the children. But towards my mother, she was always, she tolerated my mother. But when she was dementing, she became sort of paranoid. She thought my mother's poisoning her. This is after, in spite of the fact that my mother was the person caring for her. And, luckily for my mother, my father was not having any bar of it, right? So he'd tell his mother, he would tell his mother, no, you just go and sit down in your room. Everything is fine. Don't worry about it. And even my aunties, my father's sister would come home and they would tell my grandmother, don't be silly, go and sit down and go have your dinner. Everything is fine. So, they were protecting my mother.
Which is different to the people we're talking about, where mother-in-law start,
But so in this case, the mother-in-law is not, she's been disempowered by her son and by her daughters. But where there is a mother-in-law who's toxic, but there is nobody to actually disempower her. And if her son actually gets manipulated by her, then that mother-in-law is going to be, she is really creating a hugely difficult situation for the daughter-in-law. And you would think a mother-in-law who herself suffered so much oppression in her own life,
she would have some empathy.
She would have some empathy.
Yes.
Well, why is she doing this to her daughter-in-law? And the answer is in a theoretical construct, which is called patriarchal bargain. So what these women do is they have made an unconscious bargain in their mind that they will support patriarchy because patriarchy in turn will reward them. So if they look after if the mother-in-law is promoting her son, rewarding her son with love, attention, affection, he will look after her better when she gets old and she needs him. If on the other hand, she goes against his wish to dominate his wife, she could probably lose out.
Yes. And there's no options for her.
And there are no other options for her. And that's the patriarchal bargain.
No, and you touched on a little bit then your own family, and I wanted to ask you about that because you have a chapter in your book called "A Daughter is Only Ever a Guest in Her Father's Home," which is, quite disempowering when you think she goes from being a guest in her father's home to a guest in her parents-in-law's home. But I'd like to ask you about the cultural background then. You grew up against this cultural background, but we've got a young girl like you who goes on to medical school and becomes a psychiatrist. But what were you observing in your family about the differences between the way you were being treated by your father compared to your mother?
So this is the interesting thing that the children, they are pampered. Children do really well in Indian families because they are, their genes are mixed. So they're not foreign. The daughter-in-law is foreign.
Yes.
She's alien.
Yes.
She's come from Mars.
Yes.
Whereas the children, well, they are us.
Yes.
They're people like us.
Yes.
PUS,
Yes.
people like
Yes.
us.
Yeah.
No, what is it?
Yeah.
People like us, PLU, people like us.
Yeah.
So we are encouraged, children are, and you will see that if you are a service provider and if you were, especially a general practitioner, a medical practitioner, they see it all the time. The husband comes in with their wife and children, and he treats his wife like the fourth child. So husband, child 1, child 2, child 3, wife. And it doesn't often change that much.
Yes.
It's a really something that you have to make it conscious for the men. And then they start to, if the doctor points that out, they might change their behavior, but it is so unconscious.
I mean, and in that sense, there's sort of an intersection we've seen with a lot of Western men. I think, you know, even our former Prime Minister, who could only start understanding things if he saw them through the lens of his daughter rather than, you know, the other women that are around him.
That's it.
But you mentioned in your book too that when your mother wanted to, you know, work, that was something that, you know, it was okay for you to go off and get an education as a daughter, but she wasn't allowed to work.
She was a trained teacher in 1935. How many people are trained teachers in that time? And she wanted to, you know, after partition, she had a great offer of a job I'm not sure what the equivalent in Brisbane is, but in Melbourne, it's like the Scotch College, like the best school offered her a job. And she was so excited. And look, I never knew anything about it. What this was going on between mother and father. And she wanted to go and work, and she was told, no, you shouldn't work. He wouldn't yell at her or anything. No, he lovingly probably told her.
Lovingly, stay home and do what I do. But with love.
Yeah, that's right. With love, stay controlled.
Stay controlled. And in this dynamic though, you suddenly meet an Australian or a Gora, as we would say. Yeah. And I still can't get my head around how that was allowed to happen.
Yes, it is a contradiction, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, and then you both come back to country Victoria and join the farm. So how did that go down with your family?
Look, they loved him. I just don't know how it happened, but it was like, the thing was that my schoolmates, classmates always came home, which is boys and girls always came home, and they were always welcomed and respected. And of course, you know, we were all smart medical students. And so there was that inherent respect anyway. And so one day this white man came along, and that was great. You know, everyone had a great time chatting with him, and he loved Indian food, and my mother enjoyed watching him eat her food. And she said, wow, look at the way he eats with this knife and fork. It's better than my fingers, you know. He was so adept at it. And my dad loved talking to him about the world, and they had quite a big argument about India being the terrorist state, because that was the time when US were supporting Pakistan because they had a dictator, right wing. And we had Prime Minister Nehru, who was socialist. And Prime Minister Nehru and JF Kennedy never got along. And so US were supporting Pakistan and supporting the terrorism that was brewing in there. Whereas India, that has never ever invaded another country in the world. We have a religion in which we have million gods and goddesses. Everybody has their own guru and their own god.
Yes.
Everybody is so individualistic in their religion that the Hindus don't care. They don't care if you're a Muslim, a Jew, a Sikh, or Parsi, or anyone. You can come and live in India and you will never be persecuted. Or maybe some recently stuff is happening. But so
that's the context, though, that he found obviously an intellectual meeting of the minds with
intellectual.
This Gora, yes.
Yeah, but
Yes,
there
I
was
was able to accept him.
But there was an argument because he said, Evan said, India is growing terrorism. And my father said, what do you know about that? And so they had a massive argument about it. But that was, how they got on really well in discussing the world politics. And so there was this instant kind of a friendship that occurred. And so, but there was no talk of marriage or anything. So he went away.
Yes, okay.
So he went away for 6 months.
But it's all worked out. It's all worked out.
It's just good,
Yes.
that was good.
Yes.
Because then that gave everyone time to absorb and so, we were corresponding. And so then when he came back 6 months later, it seemed like they had liked him. So it was like, I think, I don't know, it just somehow, what's that saying? The camel got through the eye of the needle or something. I don't know how it happened.
So,
But,
and we would call that, in those terms, a love match,
Yes.
as opposed to arranged marriage, which is
Correct.
what we need to talk about.
Yeah.
Now, you say in the book that in India, still over 90% of marriages are still arranged. It is
Yeah.
very much the
Yes.
done thing. That is probably, something that people in Australia don't understand and don't understand how that dynamic works.
Yeah.
And why that makes it so difficult for someone to leave that sort of relationship. So can you talk to us a little bit about that, and then the extra additions of the layers of caste and dowry and how that sits with
Okay. Okay, so let me first start with just looking at what happens in the Western system, so you can place it in some context. So how do young people in Australia, for example, find a partner? You go to the pub, you go to the nightclub.
I think it's apps now. I think it's the online now.
It's online.
I think so.
Okay, it's online. Sometimes that works, not always. And but most of the time people, meet accidentally through friends or through in a pub, and so then you meet someone and you fall in love because the way he talked or he looked or his job or some intellectual discussion or something. And when you fall in love, your brain starts to produce massive quantities of dopamine. That's the chemical that makes you high, and it makes you manic if there's too much of it. And it can make people schizophrenic if there's too much of it. So that's what falling in love does. It makes you have excessive amounts of dopamine and serotonin, which is an antidepressant chemical. So when you see that person, you really feel happy. Those chemicals are really pumping in your brain. It's complete delusion. Seriously, you imagine things about that person that are not real. Come back to the same person you get married to 5 years later, and you start to see the reality.
I think we should all take this one home.
So, and so 50% of marriages break up, don't they? So isn't it better that you have older, wiser heads that talk to you about that person, and they make sure this person actually has a job that he says he has, and that he is sensible, that his family is not, crooked or drug dealers or whatever. And which is one of my dad's concerns, that he was a drug dealer. So they checked with the Australian High Commission.
This is the theory, but I guess the serious side of what we're coming to is that often when you move those marriages to Australia, it's very different, and that's when some of these abuse, if it's an abusive relationship, that dynamic of it being arranged and it being whole families that are involved brings a very strong, sense of shame in trying to leave it.
Yes, so the arranged marriage, therefore, is a marriage between two families. It is not just two people. And so when you got two families who are so intertwined into looking after the welfare of the young couple, disentangling is not that easy. And also remember that daughter is only ever a guest in her father's home. Her real home is her husband's home. She belongs there. And so in an arranged marriage system, or even in a love marriage system, she actually now belongs to her in-laws, and for her to come back to live with her father is stigma and shame.
And her father has, probably been saving his whole life for the payment of the dowry. And I was reading somewhere that a lot of fathers think with the payment of the dowry, that is in some ways supposed to be almost an insurance payment,
Yeah.
so that she will be treated well
Yeah.
by her new family.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I mean, there's a reason why dowry is now being outlawed in India, but what's happening and how is dowry abuse happening?
Yeah, so the dowry abuse then, it really got worse in the colonized time because the man's value went up and there were droughts and they still had to pay taxes. And so dowry became a way of supporting the men as well. And gradually it became a sense of entitlement for people who are going to abuse that kind of power. I just want to say again, my father never took any dowry. My uncles never took any dowry. It's not something that everybody does, but there are people who are going to abuse their power. They will use that. And so what happened was that the dowry value went up, and people who were wanting to extort, then they went on abusing that situation. And when you transfer that to Australia, what's happened is similar things happening here to some extent, because an Australian Indian groom, when he goes back to get married in India, he has an enormous value because he's going to be a great provider. He's going to bring that bride into Australia, and she's going to have a wonderful life, a Western free life. She'll go to work, she'll earn big money, and she will have, maybe she will support her.
He's selling the Australian dream.
She'll live the Australian dream.
Yeah.
And the truth is that a vast majority do. So Indian migrants, in fact, pay the highest amount of taxes. They are the highest educated group. They are the highest skilled migrants.
The largest migrant group now coming into
And they're
Australia.
the largest migrant group coming into Australia now, the biggest international student group. So, so majority of times it does come true, but then we do have places where the grooms, Australian Indian groom, wants to demand money to pay off his international student loan, or he wants to buy a house, or he might, his mother might think, she's a mother of an Australian Indian resident, so she deserves to have a diamond necklace rather than just a small little gift. So it's all very open to abuse. And because the Australian residency depends on the sponsorship of his sponsorship, the immigration system gives him a lot of power. If he is unhappy with her or with the amount of dowry gifts she brought, he can withdraw his sponsorship.
Yes. And keep demanding more gifts.
And keep demanding. And so that fear means that parents often keep giving more and more gifts, which then means that they've created a monster.
Yes. And I mean, dowry has been outlawed in India for a long time, but it seems to be that it still happens quite frequently. And you have been advocating quite strongly for dowry abuse to be recognised as a form of family violence in Australia. And I think you've had some success in Victoria, but not federally.
Yes.
How important is it that it has that legislative recognition?
It's extremely important. So we got the Victorian law. As a result of that, what we now see, at least in my practice, is that men are actually quite afraid of asking straight out for money, but it's coming from in indirect ways. And they don't ask, but they expect.
Yes, yes.
And they will say, we don't want any cash. No, we don't want anything from you. Don't give us anything. I'm an Australian resident, so I want a big wedding according to my status. Big wedding means a big fat Indian wedding, which is 4 different events and 5-star hotels costing hundreds of thousands of rupees, or at least 70,000-80,000 Australian dollars. And so we want the South Asian grooms to be aware that this is not acceptable behavior, and that the law will, because Indian people and South Asia generally, they are aware of these laws. They have, kind of antennae of, they know they're being watched. And so that has helped in Victoria. And so we have spoken to the Attorney General's policy departments of the whole of the country states as well. So I've spoken to Queensland.
Well, it's interesting too, because that does intersect with the next question I was going to ask, because the Queensland Attorney General this morning has announced that there's going to be a commission of inquiry into police responses to domestic violence. And I wondered how important it was to have that legislative change, so that when women are going to police and talking about dowry, they understand what they are dealing with. I had heard in one of the other interviews that you did that a young woman was killed by her partner, allegedly killed by her partner in Victoria, and she went to police and tried to explain about dowry, but they didn't understand what she was talking about, and that it wasn't indicated for family violence. So how critical is that?
Yeah, and then when the coroner's inquest happened, the coroner didn't pick it up at all. They said there was no issues here, and they did not, and from memory, they did have a domestic violence service worker from In Touch Multicultural Center Against Domestic Violence. They did have her there, but she didn't pick it up either.
And those police responses, if women are not getting any support at that first line,
there's no hope.
There's no hope.
And that's why we need that law. And so in Victoria, the police are starting to become aware of it, but still the education is lacking. And I think the police did order some of my books, although they haven't asked me to speak. But I do understand that in New South Wales Police, they did get a film producer to make a film on dowry. An Indian guy made a film on dowry for them. And so we spoke to the Attorney General of Queensland, and they said that we can put in a submission for it to go under coercive control.
Yes, because coercive control is about to be criminalised in Queensland, which isn't a really important step, and a step that has only come about really because of the death of a woman and her children in Queensland.
Hannah Clark,
Yes, but it is important, I think, that nuance around what coercive control might look like for different communities is a really important part of that conversation.
Absolutely. And so we are hoping that the New South Wales coercive control legislation will include dowry. Although and Tasmania have said that they will not name it because they hope it will be covered under economical abuse. So, so we are now talking to the Federal Attorney General's Department, and they are very keen to put it under the Family Law Act. And so the dowry will go in there, and what we are asking to do is to please put it in there, which will say that women who have given dowry should be returned that in full once the marriage breaks up. Fortunately for us, the Senate hearing into dowry abuse that occurred in 2018 did recommend this, and it was triggered by Julian Hill, who's an MP, a Labour MP, who has been working with me and our NGO for the last 8-9 years, and he knows exactly the work we've been doing. And so the patriarchal structures of Melbourne went to him and they complained to him that this is all rubbish, that there is no such problem.
Yes.
And then
yes.
please don't do anything. And so he said, okay, he got up in the parliament and said, I'm triggering Senate inquiry.
Yes, yes. I think that some of the Indians actually said it was an attack on Indian culture.
That's it.
Yes.
It's putting the culture to shame.
Yes.
And she's doing it for her own publicity.
Yes.
And so then only to be I receive calls every day. The other day, someone said, I have a girl, a young woman in Hyderabad who has gone to Hyderabad from Australia. I'm not sure which state, I think Sydney maybe. And she is gone there to claim her dowry back. And she's got a court case running. Is there anything you can give her to help her out? Any ideas? So basically, I have no ideas because the dowry case in India will take its own course.
Yes.
And whether she will get her dowry back, not a chance.
Yes. Okay, well, you're a psychiatrist, so I wouldn't mind talking just for the last few moments about mental health and mental
Yes.
health impacts.
Yes.
You've said in your book that Indian women suicide at more than twice the rate of other women, which is
Yes.
just horrendous.
Yes.
And I think one of the quotes from your patients is particularly telling, where she says, you say she saw serious depression and anxiety, not as a treatable illness, but as her fate.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about, the sorts of psychiatric injuries you're seeing and how important it is that the therapy you're giving, because you talk about it being very specific culturally,
Yeah.
and how important that is for those women to recover?
Yes. So if I suppose that you are now in Melbourne, anywhere in Australia on a migrant visa, there is nowhere to go, completely dependent, and you are continually being subjected to domestic servitude. So getting up at 6 a.m, preparing hot breakfast for everyone, packing their lunches, going to work.
And then you go to work?
Then you go to work yourself. Then she comes home at 4:35, and she prepares a hot meal for the father-in-law, mother-in-law, husband, whoever else is living in the house. And at night, and then she's told, well, the food wasn't good enough, or there's too much salt in it. This awful story someone told me, that there was, the daughter-in-law cooked the food.
This is my story. Yes, I told you this story.
Was that?
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah.
Say
No,
it.
no, no. I found out that my grandmother, my namesake, used to be an awful mother-in-law.
Yeah.
And she used to have, the daughter-in-law used to get up very early in the morning and cook the food for the entire extended family. And she would deliberately oversalt the food so that she would get in trouble from the whole family and be put back in her place.
So basically, the woman being told off about the quality of food being cooked. So this young woman told me that she would come home and do the cooking, and by 8 o'clock she was so exhausted she would have a glass of milk and go to bed. She had no time to eat, and this went on for months, and she became extremely malnourished. And her GP said to her, "What are you doing to yourself?" Mm-hmm. And so basically in that, so that woman, in the end, and of course at night, he wants sex. And so this was going on, for sex every night. And if she refused, then, be rape anyway. Mm. So she left him. And she was on partner visa, and he withdrew his support for the partner visa. And so she came to see me. Initially, it was the migration agent told her, go and see her. So she came to see me, and she had the most severe post-traumatic stress disorder. So basically, she was not sleeping, anxious, panic attacks, suicidal, and then flashbacks. of the rapes, flashbacks of being made to work like a slave, of the huge amount of work she would have to do, flashbacks of extreme exhaustion, of going to bed, getting up in the morning, and she'd have to take a bus to go to work because it was a long way away. And she would, it was winter time, and she didn't have enough money to get proper shoes. The most severe post-traumatic stress disorder, and it took, she was on Prozac. So then I added a number of medications to her medication, trauma therapy.
But culturally informed trauma therapy.
And culturally informed trauma therapy, which looks at the societal influences that shapes the behavior of men and women.
I assume though that it's pretty hard to get culturally informed trauma therapy. I mean, it's hard enough for people to access any form of therapy,
Yes.
but you know, that culturally informed therapy seems very important, but I'm sure it's very hard to
Yes,
access.
yes, yes.
Um,
I want to just finish
Yes,
off
sorry.
by saying that she is a manager in an IT personnel company and has 20 people working
for her.
under her.
Yeah. And I think that that's the perfect sort of way that you end that story, and you know, the outcome for that patient, and the way you end the book is on a hopeful note. And I think that's what's really important that people take away from it. You end the book with the reimagining of those ancient Indian texts, and you describe it as the reimagining of the text for the modern Indian woman who's trying to balance the contradictions of her ancient heritage, the Muslim invasions, colonizations, and the demands of being modern and educated. I guess on a final note, what is the message that you want to give those young modern women?
Yes, that's why I call the book Daughters of Durga. Okay, so I want to talk about what Goddess Durga is. So Goddess Durga is, in our scriptures about 5,000, written 5,000 years ago. And she was a goddess who was, she slayed demons. She has a lot of power within her. And Mahabharata, which is an epic that was written around 3rd century BC, about 3,000 years ago. And in that, King Arjun, he's a good guy, 5 good guys who have to fight 100 bad guys, cousins, they're all cousins over the kingdom that is split. And King Arjun is afraid because he's afraid his power will decimate the opposition. And what if he fails? And then the bad people will get, so he's caught. And Lord Krishna says to him, firstly, he says to him that you must do your duty. The duty calls, you don't think about the fruit of your labor. You do the labor as is required. And then he says to him, pray to Goddess Durga. And he did. And Goddess Durga appeared to him and said, you will win. And of course, he won the war. And so ever since then, kings have prayed to Goddess Durga to win the war, to win wars. And women look to Durga for imbibe her power. And so she's a absolute archetypical modern woman. She has a computer in the one hand. She has coffee in the other. She's got baby in the other. She's doing household chores in the other. And she's still the slayer of demons.
Still a slayer.
And so the reimagining of Manusmriti I have done is in that vein.
Yes, thank you. I think we're going to start some questions now.
Thank you. Priscilla has very kindly offered to repeat any questions people ask for the benefit of Zoom people at home. But to kick it off, this is our very first Q&A person that comes with a short bio, because Priscilla and Manjula thought it was important that you actually got to know this person as well. So please allow me to introduce the first question of the night, Catherine Rendell. She's one of the lands of Turrbal and Yugara people and is currently coordinating the Domestic and Family Violence Workaway Program for Basic Rights Queensland. DBS Workaway is a program of Working Women's Centres Australia. Catherine has worked in family and community services for around 40 years, starting with working alongside children and families who had arrived as refugees from Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia. Most recently, Catherine helped establish and manage the Specialist Domestic and Family Violence Program for women from immigrant and refugee backgrounds in Logan. She's currently on the board of the Immigrant Women's Support Service. And here is her question.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'll take that way, Zoom will see you as well. The camera
Feels a
there.
little rude to do
Oh no,
that.
sorry. If you.
So, thank you so much for giving me this chance to ask the first question. So I'll just quickly tell you a little bit about Basic Rights Queensland, after I acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Turrbal and Yagara lands, unceded lands, and Basic Rights Queensland might be a pathway that some women are able to take, that it's not the domestic violence track, or where they maybe don't have to rely on first responders to be sympathetic. So it's a community legal service, a team of social workers and lawyers who respond to issues around Centrelink and disability discrimination. So sometimes women are able to ring up about a Centrelink issue and nobody's suspicious that they're seeking information about domestic violence, and yet our very skilled practitioners can often pick up that there are issues occurring, and to assist them and to connect them with pathways to safety. My part of it is the Domestic and Family Violence Workaware Program, where we provide training to workplaces around domestic and family violence. So again, another pathway for women. So while we want to train whole workplaces to be safer, we also are part of Working Women's Queensland, where women are actually very vulnerable and are suffering at work, and a whole range, as you mentioned, of women, from people working, in manufacturing industries through to quite high level jobs in the medical field, in finance, etc. And Working Women's Queensland can support women through issues that arise at work, and in that process sometimes assist them to pathways to safety and to assist with visa issues, which I know there are practitioners here and possibly on Zoom as well, who are regularly dealing with those issues. So that's my way of moving towards the areas of practice that are not about first responders. And we know that the big systems struggle with having cultural knowledge in the mix. Your book is such a great contribution to that knowledge base. So maybe just to start off, can you comment on how you see the importance of maybe having workers with lived experience of the culture?
So you have workers from within the culture who are having lived experience. Is that
so people who are from that background as practitioners. So we can read your book, we can learn more about cultural issues. What about how important is it to also have workers from that background?
Yes, so basically, the workers from within the background, there's two things that happen is immediate rapport. You have an immediate connection with that person, because just imagine if you are living in India and you go to a service provider who happens to be a white Australian, or even if they happen to be an Indian Australian, you feel that immediate connection because there is something that you can relate to at a subconscious and a conscious level. And so this is what happens to women when they come to see me is, and as I speak in language with them, and when the woman says the word mother-in-law, I know what that word means. That has 20 layers to that word. And she says mother-in-law at the wedding ceremony, and then you know where that is going. And so the mother-in-law said she would like to have a washing machine and a microwave and all of that. And then, well, that's dowry abuse going you know, this is what I mean by having someone with an insider knowledge. You know, the story is like an iceberg. What you're hearing is the tip.
Yeah.
There's so much underneath the surface that needs to be clarified and put into words. It's not always possible to do that. It's not possible to do that in 1 hour session, which within your culture worker will pick up. But having said that, they still need to be trained.
Yeah.
Like I said, at that coroner's inquest, that domestic violence service provider was from within the culture, but she did not pick up the dowry issue. Why? Because in Australia, nobody had been sensitized to it at that point. Coming from India, she would have known all about it, but she had not been re-educated about it in Australia. So, you know, that's why we need education about the culture within Australia, Australian Indian culture of a migrant person.
Yeah, thank you, thank you.
If anybody has any questions?
Yes. You know what, I'm happy to walk the microphone around.
Sorry, how do you want me? First of all, thank you for a very educative and informative session. I've been following some of your work for quite a few years. I did some work with providers for the first groups who started agitating against dowry abuse in Delhi as an academic. I'm an academic, not a frontline. And then in Australia, it's been as a policy worker. One of the questions was, I get concerned is when we talk about the Indian community itself is very diverse and they don't necessarily see eye to eye. So when we got the community leaders to see if we could get a joint response to the Senate inquiry, the first thing most of them said, it's not domestic violence is a universal issue. Dowry is a Punjabi issue. And I said, we can't start splitting this into, and the one refuge that was here was imposing very fundamentalistic values on the women. So the Indian service providers who were from other backgrounds said, basically she wanted everyone to become vegetarian. Which we said was another form of course. So now we said, well, we can't start splitting it into Punjabi, Bengali, and we don't want to start pointing fingers. So let's look at what are the generic things, and then you can start drilling down. So I think I take your point that even if you're from India, you might not even speak the same language. And the issues become more compounded. We found also where people were married to local Australians who are not necessarily more progressive.
Yeah, that's right. Oh yeah. Look,
they may not have dowry, but there's certainly enough gender inequities and
absolutely.
And I'm married to a working class Dutch. And I found that on day one when I was handed a smaller plate. And my husband then was told that was the norm.
I mean, you know, of course it is very complex. I mean, you know, we're talking about 5,000 years of history and layers upon layers of invasions. And the amazing part about the culture, this was the Indus Valley culture, which is starting from the northwest frontier of Pakistan, coming right into northern India and central India. It had this enormous ability to absorb every culture that came along, and it became internalized and part of the Hindu culture. And Hindu is the one word, but it is highly complex, right? I totally agree with you. But having said that, there are still general principles that apply, right? So the daughter is only ever a guest in a father's home. That principle applies no matter which part of India you look at. And that is, of course, there are families who moved away from that in modern terms, but majority of the times this is still an underlying thought. And the arranged marriage is still the norm. And the fact that dowry is expected and the wedding will be paid by the bride's family is still the norm. So, you know, those norms are there and they're open to abuse. So whilst I accept what you're saying, there's diversity within Indian culture that is huge, but there are common factors that we can work through.
I think we've got some questions on Zoom.
Oh, actually a comment. I'm Sonali, domestic and family violence practitioner. I'm Indian, North India. Can totally relate to the conversations you're talking about. I'm very grateful hearing from you. Title of the book really fascinated me.
Oh, thank you. That's very nice. Thank you.
We are ready for your question.
Yeah, I'm not a practitioner or anything. My daughter is married to a Punjab man, and he's actually in India at the moment. His mother's sick. The daughter's been there once, and they're expecting a child together. And my daughter has 2 first marriage. But like you say, with the iceberg, it's just the tip. It's such a culture that I'm completely not familiar with. As a side person, not my daughter. She obviously is very open and immerses herself amongst it, but it's quite difficult to try and look at it from his perspective on how his family and arranged marriages and everything, which he wasn't into and has since married my daughter. But yeah, it's just difficult to try and understand where it all fits, I suppose.
So are you particularly worried about something?
I'm not worried. I think it's more we know how we are here in
Yes.
Australia and how things go and what we consider to be the norm.
Yes.
But when my daughter brings up situations that are happening in India,
Yes.
he's actually there at the moment because his mother's sick,
Yes.
and there's a lot of because he's the eldest,
Yes.
he is supposed to be the one that looks after the family.
Yes.
Therefore, there's money expectations. It's without going into it.
I get exactly what you're saying.
So-
I can build on that.
My daughter's sort of understanding,
Yes.
trying to. She's
Yes.
been there, met them.
Yes.
And the mother was very nice. And,
Yes.
and they were lovely with her. Like,
Yes.
found it quite overwhelming
Yes.
being there because everyone is in the house and it's just very, everyone's in your business.
Yes.
And even when she sort of went away to have some time out,
Yes.
the mother actually came in and sat.
Yes.
And she sort of said to Govinda, like, why is your mum sitting on the bed? She came in. She just didn't want you to be alone,
Yes.
which was weird because of the language barrier.
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah, there's a lot going on. It's
Yes. See, this is there are so many layers to what you just said.
That's right.
It'll take me half an hour to
That's
unpick them.
exactly
But
right.
I can just say a few things about personal space.
There's no
And
such thing, is there?
there is
In
no such
Indian
thing.
families,
There's no such thing.
Personal space, no, sorry.
There's no such thing as personal space.
Yes.
Everyone is so used to being together and so close, and the families are so close to each other that it's quite the norm to come and sleep in your bed.
Yeah.
And people don't like to be alone. They just don't like to be alone, and they're always talking. They talk a lot. And I think that the interesting thing is, so there's no such thing as loneliness. You won't find that in India. There's people everywhere. You're always talking to someone. There's always the phone ringing, and like in an extended family system, There are always cousins to play with. There's always aunties. And if I'm angry with my mother, I can talk to my aunt about it. My niece talks to me so much more than she talks to her mother. From Delhi, she's in Delhi. So she'll bring me up on every second Sunday. So she is a modern girl. She's now taken up living with her partner in Delhi. Never heard of such a thing before. So her aunt is having a very bad influence on her. So the thing is that the issue that you just brought up about the expectation of money, this is the burden on the sons. They have to look after their family because the mother brought him up, and the mother brought him up to know that he has to look after her, and he has to look after younger siblings if they're not well enough, which is what he's doing. And so what happened with my uncle, the story of my uncle, you will read in my book. So my uncle came back from Washington, where he was in foreign service. So he returned back home to Delhi, and it was, what year would have been, 50, 60, something. I was a young girl, and and we thought he was just the most gorgeous, handsome uncle ever. And within a month of his arriving, we were playing outside our home, 3 or 4 kids. A taxi stopped in Delhi, and a door opened, and out came this amazingly beautiful white woman. And at that time in Delhi, you would never see any white women. So she came into our house. So it turned out her name was Betty, and Betty said to so she came into the house. My parents came in and sat her down, and Betty said she had come to meet my uncle. She had come to meet Mr. Krishan Lal Kanduja, my mother's brother. And so he'd given her our address. And so we didn't have phone, but we did have a car and a driver. So my mom and dad said, go in the car, fetch your uncle, bring him home. He lived in the next suburb. So I went in the car, and he refused to come. He said, we called them Mamaji, uncle, this lady's come from Washington to see you. How exciting, come. He said, no, I'm not coming. And said, sorry, I had to go back and tell her he's not in Delhi. And it took me 50 years later to ask him. My uncle was he was a man of few words. I said to him, why did you not come to see her? What was that about? And he said, I don't know. First he said, oh, nothing, no one. He didn't give me direct answer, but I pushed, and he said, look, I had your aunties to get married off. They were younger than him, so he had to make sure that there was enough money for them to pay for their wedding, and there was not much dowry to be given because they were refugees from Pakistan, and all their wealth, which was massive, they were very, very wealthy people, had left behind. And so that was his responsibility towards his family and towards his sisters. And if he married her, he would have to give up all of that, relocate to America. He didn't want to do that. That's the burden on the men.
I think that's.
I'm so sorry, we are out of time, but there is a way to continue to get your questions answered. That is at the signing table. So the books are available at the counter. You will be signing them up. We'll get you to the signing table right now. In the meantime, please show your appreciation to Manjula and Priscilla for an incredible evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.